Welcome to Money Talks with Cathy Yang, your intel on the Philippine markets and the economy. In the headlines, the Philippines' trade deficit narrows to $3.16 billion in February. Leloy Claudio from UC Berkeley joins us live from California. The Zero Remittance Week protest tactic led by pro-Duterte supporters starts today. We go live with the situation on ground in the Middle East with Froilan Malit Jr. of the American University in Dubai. And Philippines represent. Art Basel Hong Kong opens at noon local time today, celebrating the best of Filipino diaspora. We speak with Silver Lens Gallery co-director Rachel Rillo, live from Hong Kong. The Philippine trade deficit narrows to $3.16 billion in February. Recently released preliminary figures from the Philippine Statistics Authority show exports in February amount to $6.25 billion, down from $6.37 billion in January. That represents a year-on-year growth of 3.9%. Imports in February total $9.41 billion, down from $11.49 billion in January, representing a year-on-year growth of negative 1.8%. The deficit stands at $3.16 billion, a shrink in the trade gap from over $5 billion in January. The U.S. remains the country's top export destination, and China is still the top import source. As the PSA releases its February balance of trade figures, let's check in on the Philippine peso and see how that's doing in the first hour and 30 minutes of trade. Our local currency opens this Friday flat at 57.37 to the dollar. The peso closed yesterday, Thursday, stronger at 57.37. With us now for more is the author of the forthcoming book, Profligate Colonial, published by Cornell University Press. Joining us live from the University of California, Berkeley in San Francisco, Associate Professor at the Department of Southeast Asian Studies, Lisandro Leloy Claudio. So good to see you, Leloy. Welcome to the program.
Hey, Cathy. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. So what does a narrowing trade deficit in the Philippines mean then, at a time of raging tariff wars among the Philippines' biggest trading partners?
Well, actually, when you zoom out, I don't think it really matters because we are not really in the crosshairs of the Trump administration, never were. If you look at the Trump administration's Dirty 15, the economies it accuses of exporting more to it than it is importing, we've never been part of that. And in fact, our neighbors are really at the crosshair. So Trump has already gone after, of course, Canada, its immediate neighbors, the US's immediate neighbors, Canada and Mexico, and it's obviously gone after China. And it has a huge trade deficit with Vietnam. So Vietnam is likely the next target here if there is going to be a target for reciprocal tariffs in Southeast Asia.
But really, it's reciprocal tariffs. That's what the markets are afraid of. I mean, we're all exposed in some form or fashion. In all the countries that you mentioned, we do have trading relations with them. So we're not really that insulated, if you will.
We are not. And of course, there's an element of caprice in the Trump administration. How, for example, are they going to compute reciprocal trade tariffs? Are they only going to look at, for example, the tariffs that the Philippines imposes on the US? Or are they going to look at other things like the 12% VAT? Because technically, the 12% VAT also applies to US imports. And if it looks unkindly at that VAT, then we could probably be within the crosshairs of the Trump administration. But we're never sure, and we'll see what happens on the 2nd of April, which Trump has called a kind of a liberation day for the US economy.
I know, but let's pick on exports, for instance. Philippine export products that would have higher U.S. import tariff rates under the proposed reciprocal tariffs on April 2nd. What would they be, and what sort of an impact could that have then?
Well, we're not entirely sure what the reciprocal tariffs will be like if they're going to compute again the 12% VAT. And we're also not sure about which industries are going to be targeted. Of course, we send a lot of electronics to the United States, but this is, of course, low-level electronics. And of course, there are other factors at play here. For instance, the Philippines is a beneficiary of the CHIPS Act, meaning the US wants to divert the production of semiconductors to friendly allies. So this is called friend sourcing. We don't know, for example, if that can offset the incentives in the CHIPS Act can offset any detriments that reciprocal tariffs can create. But I do want to mention one thing, Kathy. It's interesting because tariffs, of course, make things very expensive for US companies. And of course, they're going to want to cut costs. And one way to cut costs is further outsourcing. And we, of course, know that further outsourcing usually in the United States benefits the Philippines.
And that takes us to the business process outsourcing industry. What impact then would that have?
Well, I think it's important to note. I mean, this is an obvious point, but people need to be reminded that the primary thing that we sell to the U.S. is our services and not our goods. And our services they're not involved in a system of tariffs. So as a result, we can make money from the U.S. We can sell things to the U.S. without incurring a lot of these tariffs. And I think that's the most important thing about our trade relationship now, or economic relationship now with the United States.
Well, I guess it would have been feasible if we had that free trade agreement. We've been trying to have it with the U.S., but now we don't. But if we did have it and entered into a free trade agreement, what would that do?
I'd like to answer this as a historian. We have had historically free trade agreements with the United States negotiated by Presidents Quezon, Osmeña, and of course Rojas. But of course, those free trade agreements, most of them are gone now, except for reciprocal free trade, except for reciprocal quotas. Most of them disappeared in the 1970s during the Marcos administration. Since then, it's been difficult to have a free trade agreement with the United States because of barriers domestically. We have a lot of nationalist provisions in our constitution, which has made historically the United States wary of establishing free trade agreements with us. I think the most important thing to note now is that the appetite for free trade in the United States has gone significantly down since the first administration. So the United States has pulled away from what has been called the neoliberal free trade order. And this is largely a bipartisan consensus. I know that there's some optimism on the part of Ambassador Romualdez that maybe a new free trade agreement or new exceptions can be hatched for the Philippines. I am not as optimistic as he is because in 2016 it was still possible under a Trump administration that was less mercantilist than it is now to have that.
All right, before we go, let's speak of remittances. What are you hearing on ground there from Filipino Americans on the zero remittance protest tactic? Because 40% of the cash remittances to the Philippines last year came from the U.S., the biggest among all the countries and jurisdictions.
Well, Kathy, I'm hearing news that 20 minutes away from where I live in Berkeley, so in San Francisco, there is supposed to be a rally for the former president. But I'm not sure if the tactic here is going to be to withhold remittances similar to what's being called for in Europe and, if I'm not mistaken, the Middle East. In any case, I've been hearing reports that what some of them are going to do is they're just not going to remit during the period of, I think, late March to early April, and then they'll start remitting again. And so a lot of the money is just being withheld. And if that's the case, it's not going to do much, if it was ever going to do anything to begin with.
All right, lots to talk about from remittances to tariffs. Thank you so much, Professor Leloy Claudio at UC Berkeley in California. Now, a migrant group has criticized supporters of former President Rodrigo Duterte for misusing the zero remittance protest, saying it was meant to fight for rights of overseas Filipino workers, not defend a, quote, criminal leader. This comes after several OFW groups proposed halting remittances for a week in response to Duterte's arrest and transfer to the ICC. Migrante International says the protest has a long history, used in 2008 and 2015 to fight policies harming OFWs. Migrante Deputy Secretary Josie Pinquihan insists there should be, quote, zero tears for Duterte, citing hardships OFWs face under his administration. The group says true OFW protests should focus on workers' rights, not political figures. The Zero Remittance Week protest is scheduled to begin today until April 4th. Well, with us now for more is a visiting fellow at the Department of Political Science, American University in Dubai. He is also managing director of Rights Corridor, a regional migration platform that looks at labor migration issues in Asia and the Middle East. Please welcome Froilan Malid Jr. live in Bangkok. So good to see you, Froilan. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your holiday in Thailand.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, what are you hearing from our overseas Filipinos living and working in the Middle East? What do they think about Zero Remittance Week?
Well, I can tell you, Kathy, since the recent ICC arrest of our former president, Duterte, a lot of Filipinos were absolutely enraged, especially those pro Duterte OFWs in the Middle East. And just to sort of like point this out, Middle East is a very important region because it's the largest regional employer for OFWs. Roughly 2 to 3 million OFWs here. It's also one of the top sort of voting, diaspora voting globally for OFW elections, and roughly 13.7% remittances coming from the UAE, Saudi, and Qatar, and even more so actually because there are 17 countries in the Middle East. So a lot of OFWs were enraged, especially pro Duterte supporters. There are also those who are very basically indifferent. They didn't engage at all, and they're not planning to engage in sort of this remittance sort of protest. And but there's also a silent majority of OFWs who openly supported this particular mobilization, but in private, they decided not to and are not planning to do it, partly because of its potential impact on their families. So you see a range of OFWs actually that have expressed sort of different positions related to this.
It is interesting. It's a wide range there. And
Mm-hmm.
also remains to be seen then what they'll do in the next week. The
Mm-hmm.
Emirates, as you said, voted for the incumbent, but would that apply? And you think how they decide what to do with their remittances for that week?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what are you feeling what they do?
Well, a lot of the Filipinos that I've interviewed so far basically express this idea that, well, we'll support, so at least in principle, right, that we won't send money, but in reality, we won't, because they won't be able to sort of tolerate sort of the impact of that on their families. And as you know, in comparison to Europe, um, exerting sort of or even organizing any political kind of movements in this part of the world, or even expressing some political sort of opinions in the Middle East is quite problematic. So, withholding, as Professor Lilo actually mentioned, withholding sort of this remittances for a week, I mean, it wouldn't have as much impact at all. And most OFWs are actually not considering this. So that's sort of like what I've gathered so far based on my interviews.
Right. Could you give us a bit of insight on when and how frequently our overseas Filipinos in the Middle East remit money home? Do they do so twice a month, end of the month, their days off, like in Hong Kong?
Right. So, unlike those OFWs in the US or in Europe, most OFWs here receive their salaries on a monthly basis towards the end of the month and up to the 14th or 15th of every single month. And there's also a lot of challenges here for OFWs, partly because a lot of OFWs face a lot of, wage delays or even salary deductions from employers. So they are already in a precarious position. So for me, when I see this sort of zero remittance rate, I mean, it's highly unlikely that a lot of OFWs will participate, given sort of the economic precarity that they're already facing, specifically low-skilled OFWs like domestic workers, construction, and other service-related workers. So I think in principle, they will support our former president, but I think in reality, in private, they will highly likely not do it.
That's very interesting analysis you give right on the ground there in the Middle East. Thank you so much, Freud. Appreciate it. Freud
Thank you
and
so much.
Lalit Jr. joining us live from Bangkok. And coming right up, we'll find out how PLDT is planning to drive digital growth in Southeast Asia. And an economist weighs in on the cuts for the reserve requirement ratio that takes effect today. Money Talks on One News returns after the break. Welcome back to Money Talks. I'm Cathy Yang. The Financial Stability Coordination Council has released its 2024 Financial Stability Report, saying the Philippine financial system remains resilient despite global challenges. Key factors include lower inflation, strong economic growth, and enough international reserves. Banks also had enough capital to absorb losses, while financial markets remained stable with strong local investor support. FSCC Chair and Bangko Sentral Governor Eli Remolona says the system's resilience comes from adapting to market shifts and, quote, lessons from the past. The council plans to expand the bond market, improve reporting, and enhance financial safeguards. The full report is now available on FCC member agencies' websites. PLDT is betting on data centers and AI infrastructure to drive digital growth in Southeast Asia. Speaking at the PSC Invest 2025 event, PLDT co-CEO Butch Jimenez underscored data centers as major growth drivers, citing increasing demand for data storage and processing. PLDT has built 10 data centers and is complementing its 11th and largest one yet. Jimenez says data sovereignty laws will further boost demand for local demand centers. Meanwhile, PLDT is also preparing for an AI-powered future with GPU as a service to meet rising demand for AI-driven high-performance computing and machine learning adoption. The cuts for the reserve requirement ratio takes effect today, March 28th. Last month, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas announced a 200 basis point reduction for universal and commercial banks, as well as non-bank financial institutions with quasi-banking functions. Meanwhile, digital banks and thrift banks will see cuts of 150 and 100 basis points respectively. The announcement came after the Bangko Sentral decided to hold interest rates steady. The RRR was last cut in September 2024 by 250 basis points. Let's take a quick check on the Philippine markets again. Just minutes after trade balance figures have been released in the first 48 minutes of trading. The Philippine stock market opens by less than 0.1% at 6,142. That's an up arrow there, so it's trading higher. Stock market closed yesterday, Thursday, lower by nearly 0.5%. And with us now for more is the Chief Economist of Metrobank, Nicky Mapa. Good to see you, Nicky. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Cathy. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, so what do you make of the trade figures? We kind of expected it to be widening, but the deficit's narrowed.
Yeah, well, two things we want to take from that. First is that the export numbers were better than expected, largely because we saw some upside in agro exports. And this tends to happen when you see better agricultural production, which is what we're seeing this year post El Nino. For the import numbers, one thing I'm looking at is the sort of slow grind higher for capital goods as well as raw materials. These tend to sort of be leading indicators for growth. If you're not importing capital machinery or you're not importing raw materials for construction, then you won't be able to drive growth in the coming months. So yes, on the top line, it looks like a better number. However, with slower imports of the good kind, that might make it challenging for growth in the coming quarters.
Right, it's a nice assessment you have there, top line, but this comes as an extra 300 billion pesos is now sloshing in the financial system thanks to that triple R cut from the Bangko Sentral, which it committed last month. But where's this money all going to end up?
Yeah, so we know that the BSP has been progressively lowering triple R, and this has really been a saga carried out by previous governors all throughout the years. Started out with former Governor Tanco, who really set up the structural changes to let this happen. But now that there's a little more liquidity available for banks, it really is up to banks where they want to place that. They can choose to lend it out if man or the BSP bills. So the BSP is really shifting away from this old policy of reserve requirements to a more market-based framework in which they can siphon off liquidity. And this is really in line with their price stability mandate.
So how do you think the April 4 inflation result will influence the Bangko Sentral when it decides on April 10th?
Yeah, well, the BSP is inflation targeting central bank, so this should figure, very much into their decision. But inflation has been on the downtrend and has, even on the forecast from the BSP, it does look like inflation will stay within target this year and next year. So this, I guess, this figure will definitely come into play. But they're also looking at other factors. I think they also mentioned they'll be looking at domestic factors like GDP growth and anything related to that. So yeah, we'll see what the BSP decides to do at their next meeting.
So what are the chances of a non-move? Several central banks around the world have decided to take the pause for now, including the Fed, Bank of Japan, Bank of England, People's Bank of
Yeah.
China, Sweden's Riksbank.
Well, we do remember that the governor did indicate that the rate cut is on the table. But I guess, yeah, if you look at domestic factors, inflation, growth, they all sort of point to the need for additional easing. But I guess there are other factors that they're considering. I think the governor made mention of the, I think he termed it as the uncertainty, befuddling uncertainty. I think was the term that he used. So I think they're going to be watching global markets as well. But I think if you look at just domestic data, there's definitely space for them to cut.
Got that. Thank you so much, Nikki. Appreciate the time. Nikki Mapa of Metro Bank. In our continuing tribute to women who lead, we head to Art Basel in Hong Kong as it opens at noon today. Silver Lens Gallery, led by Isa Lorenzo and Rachel Rillo, are exhibiting a diverse roster of Filipino artists to a global audience. With us now live from Hong Kong is Silver Lens co-founder Rachel Rillo. So good to see you, Rach. Thank you so much for making the time. Rach, if you could unmute, that'd be great. The doors at Art Basel open in just under 2 hours. It's pretty exciting. I understand
Very exciting.
the
Thanks for having me.
Abad has got a huge 5-meter tall installation there, drawing on the traditions and the ancestral wisdom.
Yes, so here we're looking at Pasita Abad. These are trapuntos, which are painted and woven pieces of canvas that are about 5 meters long at the tallest. Actually more on the other side. It is in a section called Encounters in the giant exhibition center here in Hong Kong, and it's getting a lot of buzz. She is really a pioneering woman. She was very prolific. She has since passed in 2004, but a lot of Western museums have been hosting her retrospective, including the SF MoMA, the Walker, and recently in Ontario, and also the PS1 in New York. So she's been having quite a bit of a stage in the recent couple of years.
And really putting front and center the Philippine artists. You're also exhibiting works of Gregory Halili and James
Yes,
Clark. So what's unique about their works?
Yeah, so I've picked out a couple of artists that we're showing, and Gregory Halili, someone who is taking pieces of artifact, including some antiques and found objects, a lot of religious, their artifacts, that's the one you're seeing right now on the right, and places them together as cultural objects. And I think that's very endemic to us Filipinos. Maybe it is a matter of economics. We have to find stuff and put it together and make art ourselves with our hands, as opposed to a canvas and oil, obviously. And those are very exciting pieces that he's working on now, Gregory Halili.
Well, interesting as well that Silver Lens marked its 20th anniversary last year, and that marked a significant milestone for you. How have you seen then the diasporic Filipino artists evolve through all of those 2 decades?
Very quickly. I have to say very quickly. I think, Isa and I have been doing a lot of these larger fairs, and also we've opened shop in New York 3 years ago. And we just keep showing up until they're ready to look. And I feel like the timing is now. I was watching the rest of the speakers this morning, and they were talking about how it's about service. I mean, we are everywhere in the world, so we are the diaspora for a very long time, and so our work and our expression is very easily accessible everywhere else in the art world.
It is. It's really important that you open that gallery in New York City's Chelsea neighborhood. That's been open since 2022, really expanded that global audience. What role then do you play as a global gallery in growing the Philippines' artistic influence in the world?
Well, I can't speak for all of the artists, obviously, from the Philippines, but the roster that we have in Silverlands, um, they have been picked up by museums, been part of the biennales. Like we had three artists in the Venice Biennale recent, the last edition. And a lot more museums are borrowing or acquiring artworks from our roster. So I'm hoping that in the next, say, decade, you will see a lot more Filipino diaspora artists or artists from the Philippines in the big museums.
And it took two women to get that to happen, Rach and your co-founder, Isa.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well, congratulations in advance. I look forward to the reception of our Filipino artists in Art Basel in Hong Kong in just 2 hours.
Thank you very much.
Rach Rillo of Silver Lens at Art Basel in Hong Kong. And from art to sports, the country awaits the semifinals match of our very own Alex Ayala at the Miami Open against world number 4, Jessica Pegula. The match should have started at 8:30 a.m. Manila time, but the game between Taylor Fritz and Matteo Berrettini has been extended to set 3. Ayala scored an upset victory yesterday, Thursday, after she defeated world number 2, Iga Swiatek. The 19-year-old Filipino tennis player has beaten Grand Slam champions in 3 consecutive matches, positioning her to number 75 in the World Tennis Association live rankings. Ayala's opponent this semifinals is a billionaire heiress whose family owns the Buffalo Bills of the National Football League and the Buffalo Sabres of the National Hockey League. The 31-year-old Pegula has had a solid performance in the Miami Open. That's something to look forward to after this show. That is it for Money Talks. I am Cathy Yang. Catch us again Monday at 9:30 a.m. here on One News. We're also streamed live on YouTube and on our Facebook channels. Have a great weekend ahead. See you Monday.